I'm not done yet. So we've done extreme heat, right? I didn't even touch on how that affects air quality, but it does, because with the same level of emissions, the warmer it is, the faster the reactions happen that cause ground level ozone. So we've got extreme heat, we've got heavy rainfall events, we've got increased risk of drought when we have those high pressure systems over our region that bring the drought. Then we've got sea level. Sea level is rising now twice as fast as when the satellite record started 25 years ago. It is not linear, it is exponential. 4 years ago, NOAA published a report talking about nuisance flooding. Nuisance flooding is not associated with a storm, it's just flooding during high tide because you have the high tide and then you have sea level rise on top of the high tide. 4 years ago, they said that nuisance flooding has increased on all 3 U.S. coasts between 300 and 925% since the 1960s. And the report they just published last month found that high tide flooding could happen every other day in many locations by late this century. Why do we care about sea level rise? Because 2/3 of the world's biggest cities, including this one, have large areas within just a few feet of sea level. And we expect a few feet of sea level rise this century. And then, of course, we get to the hurricanes. This is a picture of Rita. Hurricanes are entirely natural events. They are part of life living on the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic coast. But hurricanes are being exacerbated by sea level rise because the higher the sea level, the more water there is for hurricanes to push on shore, right? Now, I want to be clear about something. This is a picture of our season last year. This is when we had those 3 hurricanes in a row, which was absolutely insane. You remember this? Yes, I know last season had an unprecedented number of hurricanes. But if we look over, not the tree, but the forest, we are not seeing a trend towards more hurricanes. We do not see any long-term trend in hurricane numbers. And if you look at the physics of why hurricanes happen, we do not expect any more hurricanes in the future. What we expect is some years we'll have only a few, other years we'll have a ton. That's the way it's always been, and that's exactly what we expect for the future. Why is that so important? Because a lot of people will say, oh, you scientists are always saying there's going to be more hurricanes just based on 1 year. No, for the record, we do not expect the number of hurricanes to change hardly at all. Even though we will have very bad years, but then we'll have some not so bad years. But there's a lot of factors changing that affect how bad the hurricane is. Remember what I said, we care about climate change because it what? It exacerbates the risks we already face today. So here are 6 ways that climate change and a warming planet is exacerbating the risks associated with naturally occurring hurricanes. Number 1, warmer air, more water evaporates, along comes a really, really giant big storm called a hurricane. It sweeps up that water and dumps it on us. Precipitation rates associated with hurricanes are going up. For a given hurricane, we're getting more rainfall associated with a given hurricane today than we would have 50 or 100 years ago because it's warmer and more water is evaporating. Where do hurricanes get their energy from? This picture of Rita is overlaid over sea surface temperature. Hurricanes are a very unique type of storm, tropical cyclones and typhoons also. They're a very unique type of storm because they get their energy from the ocean. As soon as they go over land, it's like they've unplugged from the wall. Sometimes they plug back in, like Harvey. But once they've lost their connection to the ocean, they have lost their connection to their power source. How is this related to a warming planet? Well, you remember back here when we were talking about the teeter-totter or the seesaw, and remember I talked about how much extra heat was going into the atmosphere versus the ocean? 90% of the extra heat being trapped by this blanket that we're wrapping around our planet, over 90% of it is going into the ocean. And where do hurricanes get their energy from? Warm ocean water. So what is our second reason why? Our second reason is that hurricanes are intensifying faster and they are getting, on average, stronger because there's more energy from the ocean. The ocean is giving them steroids. Hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico are intensifying on average 25 hours faster than they were 30 years ago. And more of them are reaching category 3 or 4 or even 5 status, whereas 50 or 100 years ago they might have stayed at category 1 or 2. Here's a brand new result that just came out. Hurricanes on average are traveling slower these days. Why does that matter? Because the longer it stays in one place, the more time it has to dump on us. Now, Harvey followed a really unusual pathway, right? And a lot of its impacts were due to the pathway, and as far as we can tell, the research isn't totally conclusive, but as far as we can tell, the pathway was probably pretty much bad luck. But it was very slow, and we know that there is a long-term trend across all hurricanes to be a lot slower these days, which is not good news. They're also getting bigger, and as I mentioned before, sea level is rising. So in other words, there's more water available for the storms to push onshore. So far we know, there's been a couple of scientific studies already published on Harvey, and so far we know that it is likely that human-induced climate change, warming, made Harvey 3 to 3.5 times more likely than it would have been 100 years ago. Today, there is a 1% chance of a Harvey every year. That's not so good, is it? Before the end of the century, if we continue on our current pathway, it could be an 18% chance every year. The 3-day rainfall total was likely enhanced by about 15% compared to if the exact same storm had happened 100 years ago. And the total rainfall was most likely enhanced by about 40% compared to if the same storm had happened 100 years ago. When we look at the risk we face living here in Houston, it's a factor of 3 things. It's a factor of exposure. How many people are there? How much infrastructure is there? It's a function of the actual weather or climate event, but it is also a function of what? Of our vulnerability. Are we prepared, or are we resilient, or are we vulnerable? And this is the one that we have the most ability to move. There is a quote from John Holdren, who was the president's science advisor, who said, "We have 3 choices, mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We are going to do some of each. The question is simply what the mix is going to be, because the more we reduce our emissions that are wrapping this extra blanket around the planet, the less adaptation is required and the less suffering there will be." So I want to finish, I should say. Ending sounds like I'm finishing right now. I want to end in the next 5 minutes. Always be clear on that. I want to end by looking at what does mitigation look like? What does adaptation look like? And what does suffering look like? To look at mitigation, the most important thing to do is to say, what's already at risk? What's already exposed? Our coastal infrastructure? Our inland infrastructure? What concerns do we already have? We already have concerns of social justice and economic inequity, aging infrastructure in bad need of repair, air quality and health impacts, freshwater inflows to critical marine systems. How do these connect to climate? Hurricanes may be what is on all of our minds, but there's more to it. We have heavy rain events, we have droughts, we have heat waves. All of these things affect us right here. So what does adaptation look like in Houston? There were some stellar examples just the past year. The golf course. You heard about the golf course, right? The Clear Lake golf course that they're converting into a reservoir saved several thousand homes from flooding. This article here, a remarkable success story that has remained untold, the performance of the Sims Bayou Federal Project, which actually succeeded in preventing the flooding that it was designed to. The UTMB facility in Galveston that had already weathered Ike and had decided to completely redo its energy system so it didn't have to go offline during Hurricane Harvey. It actually kept all the lights on, all the facilities running, all the storage of the dangerous diseases and viruses like Ebola going, did not have to evacuate because they were prepared. Buffalo Bayou Park weathered the flooding with limited damage because it was preparing. And we can see this resilience all around the world, whether it's installing drip irrigation in the dry parts of West Texas so we don't lose all our water as it falls from the pivot system to the ground, whether it's the Netherlands where they're building floating villages. That's pretty cool. So if it floods, who cares? There's amazing examples, and you're probably familiar with the report that just came out from the Houston Consortium on Mitigation. You can find this online, talking about all the different ways that we can be resilient. What does mitigation look like in Texas? The picture offers a clue. Mitigation means we're reducing the carbon emissions that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. How are we doing that and who's doing it? Fort Hood is doing it. Fort Hood decided it was cheaper, and they were right, it was cheaper for them to go with wind and solar for their new energy contract because they'd save taxpayers, you and me, $165 million, and I'm great with that. In 2016, we got 12% of our energy from wind. In 2017, we got 18%. There are 25,000 jobs in the wind energy industry in Texas. There's more jobs in the solar energy industry now than the coal industry across the whole country. The Museum of Coal Mining in Kentucky put solar panels on the roof. We have towns like Georgetown going with renewable energy because 3 business students crunched the numbers and told them it just makes sense. Mitigation looks like a healthy economy. It looks like rural jobs. It looks like Texas exceptionalism and leading and growing and continuing to be an energy leader. Mitigation in Texas looks like a lot of really good stuff. But it isn't just about mitigation. Remember the quote? Mitigation, adaptation, and what? Suffering. What does suffering look like? Suffering looks like the devastation left behind by coastal storms when people are still struggling to rebuild their homes months later. Suffering looks like ground in the Arctic that is thawing and crumbling and falling into the ocean, putting 200 Native American villages at imminent risk, and they have no money to move. Suffering looks like the country of Bangladesh. 1/3 of the entire country was underwater this September. When the monsoon came late and was much heavier than it was before. Why? Because in a warmer world, there's more water vapor for it to sweep up and dump. And what does suffering look like in Syria? It looks like a record-breaking drought that was 3 times more likely as a result of a changing climate, which, occurring on top of an incredible influx of refugees from the Iraqi war, an extremely corrupt political system, the fact that farmers aren't allowed to dig wells unless they grease a few palms, and poor farmers don't have the money to do that. Along came the drought, and it was the camel that broke many of the farmers' backs. That is what suffering looks like in this world. So, one of the most dangerous myths that we have bought into is that climate change is a distant issue. The reality is exactly the opposite, isn't it? Climate change is affecting us here in the places where we live. I don't care about a changing climate. I care because it affects everything I already care about. It affects the health and security of my family and my community. It affects the economy. It affects the availability of jobs. It affects my insurance rates. It affects food. It affects water. It affects air quality. It affects every aspect of our lives. And so that's why, as we negotiate this curve in the road together, it just makes sense to look forward and plan for those changing conditions so that we're all safe together. Thank you.